being. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. My niece, Nikki, is now a beautiful young woman. But when she was little, around 4 or 5 years old, there was a time when she somehow suddenly came to understand the meaning and logistics of jokes and punchlines. So I'm not sure exactly how that came to happen, but when it did, we all knew about it. Because she developed this amazingly funny and amazingly annoying habit of explaining every joke to everyone who heard it, even though they already got it. So someone would tell a joke and we would all laugh. Then little Nikki, through fits of hysterical little girl giggles, would try to explain it to all of us, who were already laughing because we already got the joke. Of course, then we'd all get to laugh even harder and longer because we were laughing at little Nikki, who was trying so hard not to laugh so that she could explain the joke to us that we already got. You really have to know my family. Anyway, I think that Luke has been doing some of the same kind of thing in his gospel, although not with regard to jokes. Luke has this kind of strange habit of explaining the meaning of some of Jesus' most obvious parables. We already get it, but Luke tells us again, even though we already get it. He actually does this in several different places in his gospel. And it just so happens that he did it in the gospel story that we read last Sunday. And he does it again today. So last Sunday, we heard Jesus' parable about the unjust judge and the widow who kept pestering him for justice until she got it. Like so many of Jesus' parables, the meaning of the story was purposefully and almost ridiculously obvious. That's the whole idea of a parable, I suppose. There was no doubt about the moral of the story. Jesus' point in telling it was exceedingly clear, but nonetheless, Luke begins the story by telling us what it means. He writes, Jesus told the disciples a parable about their need to pray always and not lose heart. Really? Well, no kidding, Luke. We could tell. Thank you for the explanation, but I think we already got it. We could tell the meaning of the story by the story itself. And then Luke does it again with the gospel story that we heard this morning. He recounts a parable that Jesus told about a pompous, self-righteous tax collector and a humble sinner who has more real self-knowledge than most of us will ever realize. These two people present themselves before God according to who they are and what they understand about themselves and their relationship to God and to other people. So the meaning of the story is exceedingly clear. And Jesus sums it all up for us by explaining that one of them went home justified, but then the other did not. He said, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. But God loved Luke. He wants to make really sure that we get it. So he begins by saying, Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Thanks, Luke. We got it. Like 3 times. First, Luke tells us, then the parable tells us, and then Jesus tells us again. The meaning of what Jesus was trying to teach us is hard to miss, isn't it? But here's the thing. How many of us really heard it? I mean, really heard it. The meanings of these stories are so painfully redundant because, truth be told, we don't really get it at all, even though we think we do. And Jesus was trying to make absolutely sure that we got it. And Luke was trying to make absolutely sure that we got it. Because these stories are about spiritual principles that are foundational to our life with God and with ourselves and with other people. The truths of these stories form the core of our understanding about who God is and who we are. And they teach us that we are called to belong to God and to belong to one another forever, forever. So there's really no room for not getting it. It's just too important for all of us. Hence the repetition and the redundancy. It's for our own good, I'm afraid. So the first thing to notice about this gospel story is that these two men are both praying at the temple. They're both in church. Just saying. So the crux of the story is in part of Luke's explanation of it. He tells us that Jesus told the parable to people who trusted in themselves. So who might that be? Well, clearly it would be this pompous, self-righteous Pharisee. Even his prayer is pure hypocrisy. It's blasphemy, really. He'd be better off if he just sat down and said nothing. He'd be better off if he stayed home. The prayer in which he tells God that he's not a sinner is a sin. It's a sin. Listen to what he has the audacity to say. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves and rogues and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Listen to what he has the audacity to say to God, to the God who made all those other people that he's talking about, to the God who created them all and loves them infinitely, to the God who would give and do anything for them, and did, and does. You know, in 1 Corinthians, Paul admonishes the community for acting with contempt against a brother or sister for whom Christ died. And of course, Christ died for all of us, for all of us. This Pharisee is beyond blind. He's blind to the reality of who he is. He's blind to the reality of who God is. He's blind to the reality of who his brothers and sisters are. He just doesn't get it. He missed the punchline for sure. He missed the whole point. And that is the scriptural definition of sin, to miss the mark. His prayer, in which he assures himself and God that he is not a sinner like everyone else, his prayer is itself a sin, because it's an act against love. It's an act against God. And maybe God tells us over and over again, and Jesus tells us over and over again, and the Holy Spirit tells us over and over again, through Luke and others, over and over again, because we need to hear it over and over again. The truths of these stories form the core of our understanding about who God is and who we are. And they teach us about how we're called to belong to God and to one another forever. So there's really no room for not getting it. And maybe God tells us over and over again, and Jesus tells us over and over again, and the Holy Spirit tells us over and over again, through Luke and others, over and over again, because we need to hear it over and over again. If we looked with contempt or disrespect at a person who was created by God, that is a sin. If we looked with contempt or disrespect at a brother or sister for whom Christ died, that is a sin. And we were all created by God. And Jesus Christ came to redeem us all. So there it is. It's all about love. It's always all about love. We cannot love God without loving one another. We cannot. Jesus says it over and over and over again. We can't love God without loving one another. And that's all there is to it. So I don't know about you, but as much as I think I already get it, I need to hear it over and over again. Jesus says, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. So, do you get it?